Hello, everyone. Welcome to New Polity, where we are in a brand new studio. And
Yep.
so I am uncomfortable and I
Me
have no
too.
idea where to look, and the cameras are in odd places. But the point is, it's not for our good that we do this, but for the good of others who apparently are having a better experience because we're in a nice place.
Yeah, right. There you go.
People are so fussy.
I know.
Oh, they're being filmed in a basement.
Right.
We got that comment that was like, oh, it looks like you're in like a torture chamber.
Was it the ugly goose duck paintings?
Yeah, I don't know what it was, but here we are in a beautiful studio, handmade by Dave Matthews himself.
Not that Dave Matthews.
Not that Dave Matthews, or maybe I don't know. Move to Steubenville and find out. I might have snagged him from Charlottesville. Yeah, and a special thanks to all those who sent us books to fill our shelves. We now have a very eclectic bunch of these. Let's take one at random here. Oh, that's so boring. The Apostolic Fathers, Greek texts, and English translations. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So, we wanted to mention real quick before we get started here that we are, in fact, having a event, New Polity's second annual conference. It's happening in June 3rd, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
3rd and 4th.
3rd and 4th.
It should be a great time. A lot of other fun things to do in Steubenville at the same time. And we are talking about whether America is a tyranny. That's actually the title of the conference.
That is, yes.
A little on the nose, maybe. Is America a tyranny?
Let's do it.
Well, and
Who's
I think
going to say no?
I
can't wait.
Well, we got a lot of fun people coming. I believe Mr. Deneen
He'll be there.
showing up.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Just him?
No. Schindler.
Schindler. Yeah, DC Schindler.
Chad Pecknold.
Oh, we got Chad.
Yeah, I believe so.
Wild.
Yeah.
I think it'll be a great discussion because I think a lot of these arguments concerning tyranny can lead you to the obvious question of our own country and to what degree it is a tyranny by virtue of the manner it was founded, which leads to all sorts of problems like, well, is a country really just the manner of its founding? Doesn't
Right.
it extend beyond that? What about our people?
Yep.
So I think it's a really good topic to have a conference on because you actually need to chip away at all of those objections.
If you answer yes, it is a tyranny, then that's not a good enough answer. You have to explain in what ways, what is it, how does it manifest itself,
Right.
And then obviously, what do we do about it?
Yeah.
So these will all be topics.
And if you answer no, that'd be exciting.
Get ready for some. Get ready to defend yourself.
Okay, so there you go. There's the pitch. Now today we are talking about technology as a technique of tyranny, which is kind of a soapbox of mine.
Yeah.
Um,
You've been working on technology for as long as I've known you. I think the first encounter I had with you, other than as the director of some of my children's plays that you wrote and directed, was you coming into my office with I think this was right, with like a manuscript on smart technology.
Yeah, and it was.
I think that was my first encounter with your thinking and writing.
That's right. No, and it quickly became obvious that we had a lot more to talk about.
Right.
Some of that might have been the failings of the manuscript, but
no, it was quite good.
I found myself.
I don't think it ever got published though.
No. We're
still working on it.
Still working on it, baby.
That was like 6 years ago.
Yeah, whatever. Point is, there's an awesome book on technology coming out from New Quality Press because my own people are the only ones that will publish it. It's exciting. What was exciting about the manuscript is that I started out with like a sort of just aesthetic repulsion to how much technology is taking over our lives. And when I say that in that sense, I just mean what we all mean by technology, the smartphones and our laptops and iPads and just everything that is so present to us.
It's such an amazing thing, the way that it's ubiquitous and yet almost universally despised.
Yeah.
So this is a really interesting thing, right? Some aspect of our culture that's sort of taking over our day-to-day experience, that then it's an aspect of the culture to know it's bad.
Totally.
Right.
Like,
so it's like, and this was I remember maybe 10 years ago, not even 10 years ago, at a Catholic school there was a Catholic school where I lived, and they were advertising for their kindergartners. They were advertising 1-to-1 iPads.
oh, wow.
Right. But that was a good thing.
Wow.
10 years ago.
Wow.
Whereas now no one would do that. Now it's about limiting screen time. Right.
Right.
Similarly, I mean, like when I teach the undergrads up at Franciscan, and I will ask about, we'll start talking about their phones, and I'll start asking them about their phones and how many of them think the phones have improved their lives or whatever. And like no one, what I mean, the whole class full of 19, 20-year-olds, and they all dislike the phone.
Yeah.
And yet they all have it.
They all have it.
They all carry it around. We dislike the way it looks. Like when you're someplace public and you look around and everybody's scrolling on the phone, and that makes all of us sort of disgusted.
Yeah.
Right.
And then we do it.
And yet we all do it. Everyone's doing it. We're all doing it. And not only that, we're talking about ramping it up. Like there's like, whoa, when they implant this in our heads.
Yeah.
And it's like, does anyone here think that's a good idea? Like, does anyone here is looking forward to having the smartphone implanted in their head? And like, no one really is, but we all then treat it like it's inevitable.
It's going to happen.
It's going to happen. It's like, why? Let's not do that.
It's like yeah. No, it's like Zuckerberg with the metaverse.
Yeah. It's like also, let's not do that.
You're right. Well, we're all like talking about how, we need community and how, lonely we're becoming and atomized we're becoming, and everyone knows this, and everyone knows social media is to blame. And it's like, well, let's just do more, harder.
Yeah. You better double down on that.
I think it's worth making fun of. And I think there's a phenomenological reason why smart technology particularly has this sort of element of repulsion to it, is that it maybe more than other forms really does seem to attach itself to us, like attach itself to our bodies. Mm-hmm. Like it's very intimate in our hands. It's kind of constant in our presence. It's in our pockets. It's sort of buzzing and beeping in a way that is very much like an extension of our body, only it's not. And that seems to be a kind of principle of the emotion of disgust, is something that like is intimately connected to you that is not in fact loved by you.
We could think of some easy examples.
Yeah, I think so.
That the 7-year-old boys would find very funny.
Yes, I think that's true. I think that's absolutely true. But I think people are really embarrassed when like their phone goes off during like the mass or something. Is that it's sort of flatulent. Yeah. In its effect, because it's your body kind of acting without you. Like, I didn't mean to do that. Totally, how embarrassing.
I've never thought of it that way, but it's very funny.
I think it is.
Yeah.
But we're not here just to rip on it. We're here to discuss why this might be the case. Because you can see in some immediate sense why living with something you hate has a kind of direct relation to living within a tyranny, right? Mm-hmm. You can see how like, okay, there's a certain necessity to the devices, maybe, that we nevertheless don't like. This has a sort of similarity to the tyrannical rule. Mm-hmm. But I think to understand the broad claim that technology is not just something accidentally related to tyranny, but is in some ways tyranny itself. Like tyranny itself is in some way a technology of rule as opposed to some other.
It seems like throughout the whole series of episodes here, all this podcasts, it wouldn't be a stretch to say that what we are mostly describing are different technologies, different mechanisms. We call them mechanisms directly. Mechanisms of tyranny, technologies of tyranny, because they're machines, right? Yeah. Who have a function and they do something, and
and I think to really get to the difference between, I think we need to go back to the beginning.
Okay.
Because I don't know how else to do it.
I mean, one thing we would want, I'll just say right from the beginning, so as to prompt you to do this, is to expand our definition of technology outside of the smart technology. And I don't mean you to do that right now, but just keep that in mind as you start from the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think it's a helpful starting place, because I don't think that technology is a particular sum of devices. There's a funny thing about the word technology, because we use it to mean this thing, this computer, but it's an ology.
Right.
So
like
you think about
biology.
like biology, psychology. Those are ways of knowing. They're studies, right? Theology, knowledge of God. Yeah. But somehow we don't have that in our lexicon when we talk about technology. We don't think of a mode of knowing the world, right. Even though it's sort of linguistically linked to all these modes of knowing the world. And maybe that's helpful to kind of cue in on a broader, more thorough vision of technology, to think of it as a mode of knowing, a way of looking at the world, such that the invention of a particular technological device becomes possible. Because prior to any making, there has to be some form of knowing, some form of receiving reality and seeing it in a certain way that a technological device seems like a good thing to make.
Right.
It's that we want to address, and it's that specific mode that I think is inculcated in people within a tyranny to become technological knowers, as opposed to, say, theological knowers or something, a more fuller.
Okay.
Is that a fair, like?
I think that is a good place to begin. Now you need to explain to all of us what that means.
Okay. So yeah.
I mean, I think I get those parameters that you've laid down.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. So it's a subjective mode of knowing.
Yeah.
Ratzinger says that all technology is a means of saving man from fear.
Okay.
From something he fears. Has this connection to that. When you look at the beginning, the story of Adam in the garden, you find that he was made to till and keep the garden, to shepherd it, and that this probably would have involved making things.
It would, yeah, and also to subdue and have dominion, very closely related.
Yeah. But at the same time, you find that Adam's life is assured by God.
Right.
God provides him with immortality. This is the traditional teaching on the topic.
And everything.
Yeah. You can eat of any of these trees of the garden. The trees of the garden are very important, because a fruit tree in a prearranged garden is something that gives of itself without you doing much. It's not like like Adam plants an orchard. It's like the trees are there. They're providing the fruit. Go pick it.
Yeah.
So he does till and keep, which is the language of plowing fields,
right?
And making and farming,
right?
And keeping sheep. But he does it within a context in which fruit is literally falling out of the trees.
So he's not doing this. He's not doing this because he's afraid of dying.
Right, exactly.
In fact, this is exactly the curse of the sin, is to then expose that you will toil now for your bread.
Yeah, so if we look at the story, then Adam lives with his life assured. And his making is best described as a response to the world. So he sees the world. He sees that it has all of these given natures that come from God. But at the same time, he is in a relationship as a shepherd of that whole world.
Yes.
What I mean is, when God tells Adam, hey, you name the animals, it's not just an arbitrary story. He's saying these given natures are fundamentally in relation to what you will make of them.
Right? That's right. Yeah. The world you build. Build a world out of all this.
You're a world builder.
So build this world, complete the world.
And that's, in one way, it's maybe just a lofty way of describing man's freedom.
Right.
That he doesn't come with a prearranged sort of task that you might expect from the claws of the bear or the beak of the eagle or whatever. He has a kind of possibility before him. And so when he makes, it's wrong to say that man makes because he wakes up scared and needs things and goes out to get them.
Right. So the modifying of the world then is working on the world. The modification of the world is not just a means towards some other end, but it becomes an expression of man's nature itself. It's an end, and it's
and not just an expression of man's nature. I think it really builds. I mean, this can sound kind of like existentialist or something, but I think it really makes man's nature what it is.
Yeah, that's what man is.
So, okay, who's man? Well, man's this guy that has these things called shovels. Did he have to have shovels? It's like, well, no. I mean, he decided to build shovels at some point, and it became a part of his culture. Yeah. So the point being that man is responding to nature, but because man is free, it's precisely in his making nature into something that he also becomes man, properly speaking. And in some ways we see this, right, with just virtue. Like you're born to make yourself into a particular character, a particular person.
Right.
You're not like the animal that sort of has these by instinct. So this is still, and I think that this kind of making, I'm distinguishing it from technology here, that this kind of making is something that we all still experience. You know what I mean? Like, we might sort of vaguely say, well, we work because we need money, and we need money because we need to eat. And those needs are real, because we did get rid of our sort of guarantee of immortality coming from God. But within our particular work, I think we've all had the experience of actually enjoying the work, whether in art or in just the actual enjoying of whatever the labor is. That there's a kind of making that isn't a response to fear, but seems to be an end in itself. It seems to be just part of the human project.
Perhaps where we see that in its most simple form would be, well, I'll give you two examples. Art, like what we call art.
Yeah.
And then maybe in play.
Yeah.
Like in children's play, like where they're building things out of blocks and they're making, but they're not doing it for any reason other than to do it.
Yeah.
And they love it.
No, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, but I think the danger with saying that is sometimes then people hear that and they think that the distinction then is one of seriousness. Like,
yeah, but that's not what I mean, yeah.
Adam in the garden was frivolous, or things that he made didn't do anything for him. I don't think that's the case at all.
That's not the case.
It's tricky, because what we're saying is not that Adam couldn't fulfill a need himself in any way, and that his work couldn't be orientated towards that, but that he didn't do out of fear, because he had the assurance of his life provided to him by God.
Okay. So Adam, even before his fall, you think would have built tools?
Oh yeah. I think he could have built virtually. Well, I shouldn't say anything, but anything he put his mind to, that he wanted to make for any particular end that he's creatively, reasonably establishing, he could have done. And this should be a great. This should make us feel very comfortable then in a Catholic critique of technology, because it can't be this kind of knee-jerk like primitivism.
Right.
Like,
because that's what I'm getting at. It's like, that's why I asked, like, would he have tools? Because for most people, I think in their everyday use of the everyday kind of common sense understanding of what technology is, they would say, well, the shovel that Adam makes is technology. It's very primitive technology, but it's a piece of technology. But it seems like what you want us to see semantically here is that the technological mode is a different mode than that kind of pre-technological or tool using or world building mode that is properly ordered.
Yeah, I think that's correct. So I think where you see it in the Genesis story is right after the fall. So Adam and Eve want to be like God. This is the great lie of the serpent that they believe. And I think sometimes we can take this to mean like, well, they had this sort of vision of who God is, and they wanted that. But I think that's false, or at least it's not quite the whole truth, because God is infinitely other, right? And even to Adam, in the perfection of his wisdom that was given to him by God,
he would have known that better than we do.
Yeah, exactly. So, and when you look at the whole scene that the serpent gives, what is first suggested to Eve is not so much any kind of splendid description of the divine as human inadequacy. So the first suspicion, a first dark doubt cast upon man's nature being sufficiently supplied for. Instead, it describes man, the serpent describes man as being somehow at odds with the divine nature, that God is withholding divinity from Adam and Eve, and that if they eat of the fruit that they've been told not to eat of, they will in fact get that divinity. And so it's really better described as a kind of curse against human nature, the desire to be like God. It has a kind of more negative connotation. And what happens is when you posit human nature as inadequate, as lacking, and that this is a fundamental shift, right? This is not, I recognize a need. This is saying that what the human person is not complete, is not sufficient, is not, as God said, very good, but in fact is missing something. It ought to be more. Divinity is something that would be somehow a perfection, if only man could take it for himself.
Okay.
Now, this is a fundamental shift in attitude that I think is necessary to birth technologia in the strong sense of a subjective mode of looking at the world that I'm talking about.
So can I interject? So are you saying that in the non-technological mode, our smallness, our weakness is not perceived as a deficiency?
Not at all. I think it's actually a cause for us to glory,
right,
in how we were created to be.
Even our inadequacy before the mystery of creation itself. So like you said, that the objects, the rest of creation that is laid out before us by God is are manifestations of the logos, of the thought of God, the reason of God, and so therefore surpass our own. We can participate in it, but we can't master it.
Mm-hmm.
But that itself isn't a cause for anxiety, but rather for radical creativity.
Totally.
Because within that ever greater difference between what we perceive and what God in fact has created, there's a room for infinite play, infinite creative construction or building. And so the smallness, the distinction or the juxtaposition between the smallness of man and the greatness of God is the play of extremes that allows for wonder and for adoration, worship.
I mean, imagine, if you will, because it's an easy analogy, like the father of a family. Because you often hear it said for parents, like, "Oh, all of you children are so different. You're so surprising. I don't even know." Like, they say things like, "I don't know where you came from. You're like this totally new creature. I'm like in awe. I'm watching this happen." As you grow up and become something that I never could have expected or anticipated, and I'm always responding to like these differences as they come up. Now, imagine a parent describing that and being like, "And it's terrible because I want to master you."
Right.
Like the point is that creation exceeding us, the world exceeding us, is precisely the cause of our joy. It's like it's wonderful.
No,
it's
I see it.
It pulls us along. And the moment that we say, creation is exceeding us and I don't want it to, can only be it is essentially idolatry. Because what it's saying is, I want my relationship to creation to be, I would say like unto God's, but what I'm really saying is like what I can imagine God's to be.
Yes.
Because I think God is not, he's not just like a tyrannical master that has perfect, we're not going to go there. The point is that it is trying to be like God.
Well, in the sense
because
that
it's not, God is not surprised in a certain respect.
That's right. Yeah. That's what I was about.
Because God is not small.
Yeah, exactly.
And it all comes from his hand, is what I'd like to say. But the point is that creation doesn't come from our hands. And so it does always exceed us and surprise us. I think it's in the Psalms where it says about man, you have made him little less than a god. And when before thinking about technology, I used to think of this as a kind of purely hierarchical point, like he's there in the order of being less than God.
Angels
But I think that David, if David wrote that one, I forget. I think he was saying it very joyfully. Like that is the glory of man, to be little less than a god. And that little less is where all his freedom lies. I mean, he is responding to a given world. Okay, so in the garden, that fundamental attitude shifts, and now man and his desire to be like God, now he sees his nature as lacking, and because it's lacking, he sees a possibility of it being fulfilled. Now, I would say in some ways the first technology in this sense is the fruit of the tree. And the reason I think this is important is because it's obviously not a technology. It's a creation of God. And this points to the fact that that technology is a mode of being by which we look at the created world in a certain way. So now that fruit of the tree becomes the means by which human nature can be fulfilled in a fundamental lack, right?
Okay.
Now, obviously, this is a lie, because we don't have a fundamental lack in some ways. Like it's not. It's a false comparison, right? To say to say I'm mad because I'm not like God is like a son saying I'm mad because I'm not the father. It's like just a false comparison. So right after this, Adam and Eve sew themselves garments of leaves and hide themselves. And they're ashamed of their nakedness. I think it's important to recognize that this follows from the technological shift, that now the same beings that would be like God find that they're not. And in comparison to divinity, in some ways they fulfill their false prophecy. They say, oh, we're lacking, so we're going to try and be like God. Well, when you do try and compare yourself to God, then you do in fact appear to be lacking.
That's right. Yeah. I see.
So it's this mode of being in which that lack actually becomes real in society. And so they do see themselves in their nakedness as lacking a covering. So they are literally trying to cover their own lack. And this is where Ratzinger says, well, all technology is a means, for attaining man's security. And the Catholic tradition says, well, that was the moment where we rejected God's continual gift of our immortality. And it's really all one. It's all one movement in which now we want to be masters of creation. We want to be able to order it towards a fulfillment of a lack that we ourselves are positing. And we kind of get what we ask for, namely the appearance of ourselves as inadequate, as lacking.
Yeah.
Now,
I can see this.
Okay.
I see how this is developing.
Okay. Well, thanks.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is a great experience for me because to have you run through it.
So the trouble now is once you do posit human nature as lacking, you do get what you ask for, then technology has a sort of twofold. On the one hand, it's, I think, that evil. It's that very gaze upon creation that comes from a presumption of human lack. On the other hand, now you really do face lack. Now you really do have to toil. And so technology, in terms of creating in order to fulfill lacks, is a good. It's a relative good.
Right. I see.
And that's the world we live in.
Right. Okay.
Is a world in which we have both experiences, fallen and unfallen. Yeah. Like fallen in the sense of I fear, and I fear for others, and our immortality is not assured, and so I create things, I order creation. I looked at creation and see it as orderable to the fulfillment of all of these lacks that are real.
Can I try to summarize or re-articulate some of this and see if I'm getting it? Because I'm thinking about that with the way we were describing the smallness of man versus in juxtaposition to the sort of greatness of creation, and that was the context for his freedom. And for the unbelievable rationality of man, that he can play within that distinction. That after the fall, the desire to be like God, who doesn't have that, right, who sees it all exactly the way it is, that the drive becomes, well, let me put it this way: the ever greater difference between what we perceive and what's really there becomes the source of terror. Right. It's like the blackness. It's the abyss behind the creation that we engage. Like we know it's unpredictable. It does things we don't understand. Yeah. It's scary. Yeah. Right. The world becomes scary because it's infinite in a sense. Right. Yeah. Okay. And so, but then the drive becomes then the bit that I do understand. So that piece that has already been sort of humanized. I have named the animals. I've ordered them in a certain way. I'm building a world for me to live in. I want that to be totalized, right? Because how do I get rid of the fear? Well, the fear is always the fear of that great dark beyond. Yeah. And so what I do is drive that out or try to drive that out by expanding my world, the world that I do directly control, which is trying to be God, it's the end game, of course, is to have everything that we encounter be the entire world that we encounter being the world that we've created.
Right, and so we're perfectly secure because it can be perfectly known in advance.
It's a thing we've built in its entirety, and not as a humble participant in the reason of God, but through our own rationale.
Yeah.
So this feels to me like the sort of Baconian project of subduing nature and knocking it to the ground and dominating it, right?
Right. And I think it's there in the Bible because you go from here, you kind of have an increasing wickedness of man who is described as he increases in wickedness as inventing technology. So right before the flood narrative, you have the building of the first cities, and then you have the development of like weaponry, iron, even like musical instruments and stuff. It's very different than, say, a pagan model where like all the crafts and arts are kind of given by the gods to man through these various stories.
Right.
As far as, maybe this is not true, as far as I've read, the Jewish understanding seems very different in that like these things come with increased wickedness. But I think it's not because these things are like intrinsically evil, if that makes sense, but rather there's a narrative here. And as man gets farther and farther from the garden, he is more and more trying to make the world like you described, coming from his own hand,
right?
Being like God.
But that's digging the hole deeper.
Deeper and deeper until you get to Babel. Because Babel is like a literalization of this, right? It's an actual attempt to have a man-made world, which, I mean, we talked about this in a previous episode, where it was understood that even to the point of not being able to leave it, like it was a physical enclosure in some ways.
Yeah. But it seems that the second half would be what you were talking about, how it sort of becomes a self-fulfilling thing, because I think when you build to the extent that you increasingly attempt to live in a world that has been subdued to your domination, the more you do that, the more the ever greater difference. I keep saying that because that's the second half of the analogy, right? For every similarity that can be noted between the creator and the creation, an ever greater difference has to be noted. That's the basic formulation. And so it seems like as you build the world that you dominate in an attempt to live in it, the ever greater difference becomes ever greater, the difference does, and ever more removed from what you've built. So it's scarier.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, so you're creating almost more points of vulnerability. So the more complex the world you build is, the more needs or wants that you're incorporating into it, the more points of exposure to that fear that you've constructed.
Yeah,
you see what I'm trying to say?
Absolutely. I think one way of then understanding this as a technological gaze on the world then is to say that, well, one of the differences between the way we might understand a positive making and then technology in this sense is that technology in the pejorative sense is a permanent project.
Because now you're always, it's like playing whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
I mean, now you're like always you're trying to drive it forward, and in doing so, digging the wound deeper and trying to drive
But okay, so now tyranny is in some ways just a way of articulating this. Tyrant, we've said again and again, is the one who rules for private gain. But even in that motion, even in that description, you could easily replace that with someone who subdues for private gain. Right? Yeah. So someone for whom the project of world building is for himself. And I think sometimes we have, the wrong view about this because we think of this in terms of like, well, self-aggrandizement, like you want to be bigger and bigger and better. But the point is, you don't want to be bigger and bigger and better unless it's scarier to be smaller and smaller.
Yeah, right.
Right? Like it's always
people
a fear.
I mean, like this is something that Hobbes knows, for example. that the drive for power is the result of fear.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think of I mean, it just seems practically true, right? Like you think about any bully's sort of origin story. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah, no,
it's
that's
always
right.
like someone else was beating up on him, and then at some point he finds out that the only way, or what seems to be the only way to not get hurt, is to hurt others first.
Right.
Um, and tyranny is in some ways just an expansion of this. So there's a reason that there's this sort of literary and historical connection to the tyrant and like the child, the ruined child, the spoiled child, is that it is a quite literal defense mechanism against a scary world, is to take that power all for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So when we said, and we've said before, that Adam was the first tyrant or that Eve was the first tyrant, it's not really the deep extension of the notion of tyranny into other stories. It's the other way around. You know, Eve wants to rule for private gain.
Yeah.
Like quite literally rule the world
Mm-hmm.
for private gain, to subdue the earth to protect herself. What's lost is this world building project, and the way you see this within technological development is that technology becomes, again, a permanentized project that seems to have a life of its own, because we must continually refashion the world against a constant lack in humanity. This is distinct from a vision of making that is simply responding to a lack in order to eliminate it. But then once it has eliminated, or once there is a equilibrium or a peace, that there would be no more need to continue to develop technology for its own sake. Mm-hmm. But maybe we could talk more about that, because I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm trying to imagine the sort of non-technological farmer inventing the shovel.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to imagine this situation. I'm farming, I'm tilling, I'm growing food for myself, my family, whatever.
Yeah.
I'm at peace.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to myself, I could use this stick and this piece of metal here in order to do this more joyfully, more productively, produce more abundantly.
Right, and it would depend on your ends. Like,
sure. So I desired more productivity, say, but for whatever reason. But the point would be that once I built the tool and was using it for what I had built it for, mm-hmm. At that point I've reestablished peace. I'm now stable again. Yeah. Like I don't feel the need now to make a steam shovel.
Yeah. And the only modification I'd give to that story is that since we do live after the fall, you might build the shovel out of fear.
Okay.
Of say a real scarcity.
Hunger.
Yeah, hunger.
Okay.
Because it's real.
Yeah.
So it's not to say that Adam couldn't have built shovels. This is the important part.
Right.
Fear is not the only motivation. It's just that fear is now a real motivation.
Okay.
But the difference is that there are, from now on, two types of people. There's the city of God, there's the city of man, there's tyrants, and there's those who work for peace. And those two people will do one of two different things. I mean, the peaceful person, when he achieves peace, has actually achieved his end. He's done. He's done.
Right now, he just lives in it.
He rests. He enjoys it.
Yeah,
enjoys the goods. The fearful person, because of the fundamental curse he has against human nature as being lacking fundamentally, being not very good, not being like God, living in a world of scarcity in which nothing is assured, must continue. Maybe it's not just the shovel, maybe it's the next tool, maybe it's the next
well, if anything, that drive is accelerating, because now he has more to lose, he has more exposure, he has more pieces in play.
Yeah, sure.
Right. Okay, so he becomes more efficient, not less.
Yeah.
His technology makes things worse.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, and maybe the best way to see this is then to sort of jump ahead to our era, and then look back a little bit, because we barely even think of technology as a mode of looking at the world as orderable to the fulfillment of a totalized lack in human nature. But as we mentioned at the beginning, we have this apparent just incapacity to do anything but develop technology and to make it bigger and better and more. And sometimes when we even know that it's not actually better in relation to any kind of happiness for humanity, even if it's somehow better in relation to itself, right? So it's a strange world, but it's also one which I think has a real consistency to it, right? Because if the lack is fundamental, so if human nature is fundamentally not very good, then the creation of devices which are supposed to heal that lack have no theoretical endpoint. There is no theoretically possible peace, because what you're talking about is a depravity of our nature.
Right.
You're not talking about a accident or a limited fall of man that actually can be redeemed in some way. You're talking about a never-ending permanentized condition of war and fear. And one of the ways that we wage that war is by continuously making stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it gets weird in our society, because what we've found to actually give us the power to save ourselves from lack and fear is money, right? So this is where it becomes really interesting, because obviously you can hear all this and say, okay, well, if this is true, why are we making smartphones? Like, would you really say that the creation of the smartphone is the creation of something that's responding to like a fearful lack in humanity? Because it seems like it's just giving us stuff that we didn't even need before. I mean, like, we weren't there with the fear of like, oh, I don't have any apps to play with in my quiet moments. Like, it just wasn't there. And it seems like a lot of, maybe even the majority of our technological development is kind of like that, where
it's shifting more that way.
Yeah. Where like when we create things, it's not clearly fulfilling a need as much as creating it.
Yeah, so it's a weird phenomenon. It's a weird thing. So when I was studying economics, taking economics courses back in the 90s, it was still the case that the professors would talk about economic development and just sort of assume that we were talking, maybe I've talked about this before, but just assume that we were talking about products or innovations that satisfied real needs, right? Like we just always assumed that the innovations we were talking about was like penicillin, like or even things like vacuum cleaners or stuff that was like, okay, this actually makes tasks that we have to perform, like cleaning, easier, right, or better, or things like that. But what's weird what's changed in the last 30 years is the shift to massive business practices, massive sort of economic endeavors that are not about improving or improving needs, the satisfaction of needs that are long standing, like feeding people, healthcare, transportation, but is actually the creation of new realms of needs.
Yeah.
Right, that didn't exist before. Yeah, I think that is novel.
Yeah, and in some ways
somewhat novel.
Well, in some ways, it's just part of that permanentization process. I think about like something like the car. A car can be seen to fulfill a lack, right? Like if you had a world in which something is far away and you need it,
right,
then a car gets you there fast,
right?
And it's great. And within a peaceful, just society, once that need is fulfilled, it's institutionalized as doing just that,
right,
fulfilling that particular need.
Yeah.
But there's a twofold thing that happens when the people who are making the technology are themselves after a kind of security that comes not through the device that they've created, but the money that the device creates. Then there's no theoretical endpoint to how much they want to sell that particular device and how they want to maximize it within culture.
Yeah, its satisfaction or its mitigation of some want is incidental to them.
Right.
They don't care.
Absolutely.
That's just useful. That's just a useful circumstance to being able to sell more of them.
Right. Absolutely. Which is why some things we create.
So this is very, very different than the shovel that the farmer invents, because he needs it to dig a hole.
Right. Absolutely.
Apple doesn't need the iPhone for anything.
But money, he needs it for money.
Yeah, for money. Yeah, but the actual satisfaction of whatever the want is something that they're not concerned about.
No, that's correct.
Unless it's only to the extent that it affects their ability to sell them.
Right. But then what this does is once you have entered into this technological mode of being where there's no peace and no rest, but a constant war against a fundamental lack in human nature, what you end up doing is obviously permanentizing and expanding whatever technological device you're using to get that security and peace, in such a way that it really does become a necessary part of human society. So what I mean is, like, once you have a drive for everyone to have a car, then at some point it becomes necessary for everyone to have a car, even if the drive wasn't based on the need for everyone to have a car, but was based on the need for some people to have money.
Right.
So, and I think we should be clear what I'm saying here. I'm saying that the creation of a sort of indefinite permanentized expansion of a technology is tyrannical. It's the way in which some people rule for private gain, and it really does create a world in which people eventually, because the world has changed in relation to the new technology, now do have to operate with that.
But the reason why
device.
the people are susceptible to it to begin with, so the reason why people are susceptible to the cars is because they also perceive this lack, that they can only move so fast, and a car lets them move faster.
But I don't think we should forget that this isn't. Yes, you're correct, but it really does have to be. People have to be convinced.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. They have to be shown it.
The normal model for human beings is to seek after peace, and where there's a particular lack of that peace, to find a way to solve that problem,
solve the problem,
and then to go back to that original rest.
Right.
What we talk about with the garden and the fall is also true, like, every day. That there's original peace, and then there's a fall that happens, so it's problematic, and then there's an effort to get back to that original peace. I mean, this is like, it's not just the historical narrative, it's also like the day-to-day narrative.
Yeah, right. No, yeah, of course.
So people then are naturally, I think, suspicious of technological innovation, because for whatever particular need it solves, the moment that it goes outside of solving that particular need, it is by necessity disrupting other peaceful society.
Yeah, right.
So like even the expansion of the automobile, like, there was a huge anti-car movement in America, of all places, that obviously now is sort of unthinkable, but like, that cars were menaces. They were luxury items for the rich that were they were unsafe on the road. And there was a steady campaign of propaganda and advertising and lots of money putting in and change in laws to make cars normal and necessary, and to quell any attempt at limiting the car so that it simply served, say, this particular need. And
this is all very interesting, because it's something I've been thinking about entrepreneurship, because what you're describing is, it seems like it allows us to see how we can take something like entrepreneurship and actually divide it into two different kinds of activities.
Yeah.
So you have one activity that perceives a real problem, that looks for a real problem in society and human life, and then seeks to solve that problem. Right. And that can be one form of entrepreneurship. And then you could have another one, which would be that looks at society and tries to find places that are at peace, and then seeks to disrupt those places.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And in disrupting those places, create opportunity for the production of some new piece of technology. Right. Totally. And that those two things, we might be confused, and our normal sort of economic discourse doesn't have the criteria to distinguish between those two things. We just call them all entrepreneurs. Right. But in fact, they're not the same activity. They're two different activities. Yeah. One's tyrannical and one is not.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we've said from the beginning that tyranny only exists through cruelty, through the inflicting of some pain.
Right.
And I think you're saying the same thing in regards to technology, right?
Right.
Or rather, bad technology. Let's say.
Yeah.
Right. That there are certain things that we do and that we make that only exist because we are continuously creating the wound that technology then heals.
Right.
And in some ways, like I go to transportation because it's a very obvious example of this. Like transportation, the automobile, which obviously can serve certain needs, um, only exists as a necessity, an absolute constant source of profit. Everyone has to have a car, insofar as we remain atomized, distant, and have no walkable communities where
Sure.
like no life without it is possible. And those, they go together.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, very, very clearly, I think. One thing that becomes very interesting here for me is the way in the digital age, things have changed, and I wonder what you make of this, because you look at the car age, the motoring age, okay, that Ford is selling cars to the consumer. And so he wants to create the demand and create the need for it and all of that kind of thing. But there is a certain degree of like caring about the consumer, certain degree there. But in the digital age, it's weird because the consumer, we get confused by this, but like people on Facebook are not the consumer. Facebook, the consumer are the people buying ads, right? So Facebook's business is by selling ads to companies. They're the consumer of Facebook's product. The people on Facebook are what Facebook is selling to them, to the advertisers, right? Or what the advertisers are buying, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay, so, but my point would be that there's even another degree of remove where there need be no problem. The problem that they're seeking to solve is the advertiser's problem, not the people on Facebook's problem. Do you see what I'm saying? And so they need not be concerned about satisfying a real need of the people on Facebook at all. Like that's completely incidental.
Right.
100% incidental. In fact, it's probably the case that making their problems worse helps Facebook's consumers, which are the advertisers. Right. So they would want to increase that sense of lack, that increase of anxiety, that sense of panic, which is of course what they do. Right. And so what's the solution? What's Facebook's solution to this? Well, it's just, the creation of like the metaverse, which will just be total marketing,
right?
A whole world that the world itself is an advertisement, right? Like that's what they're building, and then trying to pass it off as if it's going to allow us to connect with our friends, like we're their customers. Like they talk to people like we're their customers,
right.
And that's so funny that people mistakenly think that we are.
Yeah.
But see, I think the same sort of thing happens with the phones. So it's like, oh, Apple makes great products, Samsung, whatever. And it's like, sure, but the phones themselves, it seems like what they're really after is the ecosystem, right? They really want is the engagement, the constant engagement that then allows them to sell your engagement to bigger entities and other entities.
Yeah.
Right. The phones themselves, or the product itself is probably no doubt a secondary importance.
Yeah. That's why it's easy to get a free one.
That's why you get a free one, right? Yeah, no, that's right. So when that starts to happen, then you can really see how the technological mind, because now those people, those tyrants, are viewing the human beings below them, those human beings themselves, as just pieces of the world to be turned into mechanisms that provide gain for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and it's in some ways this is always present. That, I mean, again, we think of technology as sometimes limited to like this or that device, but it's also always the creation of like what we would call social technology.
Right.
And one of the experiences that I think people have in a technological age, and that I just want to sort of affirm is in fact the right thing to be experiencing, is one of being of having one's freedom limited, and of being more bound by laws, it seems. Like, so what I mean is this, like Facebook is, or yeah, I'll just use Facebook. Like Facebook is a sort of extreme example because, Facebook offers you, the ability to communicate in all these different ways. Um, but only insofar as you enter into this purely man-made world, and so are subject to all of its laws. I mean, you can
Right.
only get the ends that Facebook offers insofar as you're literally following. I mean, it's code, right?
Right. Yeah.
Code
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
another word for law. So
Law.
insofar
Right.
as
Yeah.
you're not going against any of the laws, you can utilize Facebook, and this is becoming maybe more obvious with like censorship or whatever. But it's just part of the device itself. And I think we feel this way about cars sometimes, where it's like, okay, the car has this great freedom attached to it, but we only get to utilize the ends of the car, which is to move fast, insofar as we enter into a massive structure of laws that bind us in where we're able to go. So it's like, yeah, you can go really fast on just these roads and according to these laws,
right,
and in these color cars.
Yeah.
So there's the link to tyranny here is that law is always a kind of technology, or technology is kind of law. There's a way in which they're interchangeable, because it is a way of getting people to behave within a human world.
Yeah, like a structure.
Yeah,
a human structure.
Now, this is not to say that law is bad. This is where
of course,
where it gets tricky, because obviously what we're distinguishing is two forms of world building here, right?
Right.
Just as there is a making that is not technological in the sense that we've been describing, there's a law giving that's not technological in the sense that we're describing. But I think one of the characteristics of a technological society is laws that seem to be, what's the word here? That are kind of unchanging or unchangeable, that have no dynamic to them.
That create the illusion, perhaps, that they are a part of the fabric of reality itself.
Yeah.
I mean, I think about this a lot with the digital world because of what you said, where the world becomes so the world becomes the world that we inhabit, the digital world that we inhabit, is a world that is directly created by men, structured by men, that obeys the laws of men, right? So to the extent that we're in that digital world, that extent, the technological drive has succeeded, right? Like, what I mean is that sort of infinite mystery that lies behind all of creation has been done away with.
Yeah.
There's nothing on the internet that's mysterious. There's nothing about the digital world that's not just what it is, right? Because it's completely man-made. And so to the extent that they can make people or get people to live in that world, right? The more and more and more and more, to the point where it becomes the primary world, and the physical world in which they actually live becomes the secondary kind of awkward kind of place they'd rather not be. That you're maximizing the tyrannical because you're maximizing the technological, right? It's an attempt to finish it in some ways, right? But the reason I was thinking about that, because of what you just said about feeling constrained, because one aspect of this obviously is that in the digital world, it's a world of owners, universal private property. I mean, what I mean is that, like, when you're on Facebook, you can get kicked off at any time. You have no rights on Facebook. You have no rights on Twitter. You have no rights on any website, right? Because it's owned by somebody, and it's somebody's private property. So it's like you're building a world that doesn't have sidewalks, right? Like, it doesn't have it doesn't have streets. It doesn't have parks. It doesn't have the courthouse. It doesn't have the common world that hasn't been enclosed. And one way of thinking about it would be that's like a world that's been totally enclosed or perfectly privatized.
Yeah.
Right. But all of those ideas of rights, those ideas of free, like the liberal conception of negative rights, freedoms, I think always sort of rested upon the reality that we inhabited a world that was still beyond our total control.
Yeah, right.
You know, like we still lived in a world where, like, you say something like free speech, that has free speech where? Not in your living room. You can tell me to get lost. Right. Not in any piece of private property. They can tell me to leave. Free speech, that right, for it to have any content at all, you know, obviously implies some sort of a shared world that nobody controls. But that's, I think, exactly what the digital builders, the builders of that world, are seeking to eradicate as best as they can. So maybe it's like it's very appropriate that when we say technology these days, we immediately turn to, in our minds, to the digital, because that's maybe like the perfect as of yet manifestation of this exact dynamic that you're talking about.
Right, absolutely. And it distinguishes itself from, I mean, one thing that I think gets misunderstood is that you can have technology that goes the other way, or rather you can have human making that doesn't tend towards this sort of permanentization of lack and this ever expanding I don't know, war to be like God by creating a purely man-made world.
Right.
So like the Middle Ages are largely a good example of this. You know, there's technologies in the Middle Ages. There's agricultural developments, you might say. There's cool things like water wheels that are
totally used. Man. Water wheels are neat. Windmill, it's pretty cool.
You know, there's even stories about
people are always talking about like the horse collar. I mean, really, it's funny because I'm a medievalist.
Yeah,
but I still like laugh when medievalists are trying to defend the Middle Ages as being not the Dark Ages. And one of the things they'll come up with is like, well, they invented the horse collar so they could pull a heavier plow. It's like, wait, hold on, you're talking about 1,000 years, and you could actually list the inventions like in a fairly short list.
Right.
I mean, anyway, seems to be defeating the purpose.
Yeah, it does. Well, I mean, this is obviously like a technological age desiring to make a technological age out of the Middle Ages.
Yeah, right. Because
they're just like us.
They were like us. They weren't.
You don't have to. You can like them because they're a lot like moderns.
Yeah, exactly.
As if
they invented the stirrup.
So, but when you look at a period of 1,000 years in which you can list the sort of developments, what immediately strikes you is that technology has no kind of permanentized dynamic where it's growing and people are just following in its wake. I mean, it seems to be just an example of the implementation of an Edenic kind of making as best as is possible in a fallen world, because you do have these needs, you do have these lacks, and so you create a particular thing, because these weren't dumb people.
I mean, they were just as smart as we are.
Yeah,
smarter. A lot of them.
and so when they see a particular need, they can fulfill it.
Yeah. And if they'd really thought about it, they could have invented the Model T.
Oh, I think so.
Like, they're just human beings.
Well, there's a story I really love of Saint Albert the Great making an automaton, like an actual machine running on something, showing it to St. Thomas Aquinas, and Aquinas destroys it because he thinks it's an evil. I don't know this is true.
There's other stories similar where people invent, or there's accounts of people inventing things that seem to be like little steam engines.
Okay.
But that they thought they were just toys.
Yeah.
And it was like, fun. Wow, you made like a little engine, and your mind went to, it's a toy. Anyway.
That's awesome. Yeah. The point being that something has to change in our fundamental attitude to make technology into what we think of it now as a developing, progressing, each thing followed by the next best thing. Like, you have to want that world. Mm-hmm. If you don't want that world, if what you're looking for is peace, then once any particular need is met in a reasonable way, then that becomes an institution. It's like, okay, yeah, now we have water wheels.
Right.
You don't have a development of it's not like it then rockets off onto its own ever improving development, because what that requires is the presumption that at any moment it can always be better, you can always do more, you can always further assuage the lack in human existence, because peace is never really possible.
Yeah.
Rest is never really possible.
Scarcity is always the condition.
Yeah. And that kind of world is what's strange. I mean, I know that this should be obvious, right? I mean, just go by the numbers. If you have 1,000 years of no like none of this technological development, and then suddenly with like the invention of, the factory, I don't know, you've got, a seeming dive into just ever improving products,
Right.
While humanity becomes miserable and distraught and then starts killing itself at greater numbers than you can possibly imagine.
Yeah.
So that all occurs, and then we're like, oh, the Middle Ages were strange, what prevented them?
Well, those guys were so backwards. What prevented them? They must have had some sort of overpowering government regulation that kept them from, or some sort of moral code that was insane and forbid them from lending at interest,
right,
or something, something like that.
Yeah, no, totally. So we look back with this modern vision, and then say the Middle Ages were strange, when obviously they would be the first to call us.
It's a very interesting. I think this is interesting because very often when you and I and others start talking this way, people get mad at us because they think, oh, you guys, what are you talking about? Going back to subsistence farming? What are you talking about? Some sort of, we want to be peasants again, and something like that. But the thing about what you're saying is that that's not the case, because, like you said, when the water wheel is invented, great, now we have water wheels, and those water wheels satisfied a real need, and so they persevere through history. Now it's a civilization with water wheels. But the point would be that, were we to convert, if we just like had that thought experiment, if our society was to choose for Christ again, that I think we would be able to, because of that choice, we'd be able to discern what was hurting us and what was really helping us, and that we would be able to, like the Middle Ages retain the water wheels, we would be able to retain, say, modern medicine to a certain extent,
some of it,
to the extent that it serves
totally.
us. To the extent that these things serve us, and there's nothing wrong, there's nothing inherently disordered about making or about tool making, right? And so it allows, I think, it seems like even if those tools may have been initially invented with the improper drive, the improper sort of technological drive, doesn't mean they can't be converted to the proper way of understanding tools.
I think that's right. I think there's no technology. I mean, there's somewhere it becomes a ridiculous thought experiment, like
nuclear bombs.
I was going to say nuclear bombs, yeah. But the important part is, it's not because anything inherent in the making of the bomb. It's just that you would never make that unless your end was what the end of the nuclear bomb is.
Yeah, maybe we could use them to blow up like a comet.
Right, and then it would be good.
Yeah.
If we needed it. That's my point. So yeah, there's no technology that you can't conceive of. When I say technology, I mean like technological device that you can't conceive of being used in a mode that doesn't presume a universal human lack that has no redemption. And Christianity is, frankly, the answer in salvation from the technological age, because it can speak right to that age and say, no, it's supposed to be for the good. Technology has no life of its own. It is a human reality that needs to be orientated towards human happiness, salvation. It does it explicitly and intentionally. Whereas I think when we look at like a lot of peasant communities, not simply in the Christian Middle Ages, but any subsistence peasant community, it's not like they're doing it as a salvific mode as much as they're just maintaining the peace. So I think Christianity gives us the ability to rebuke a technological age and actually, and the reason, I mean, there's examples of Christian communities doing this. I mean, like our community largely doesn't, at the very least, I would say largely doesn't let children have smartphones. I think that would be fair.
Yeah, sure.
Adults,
overwhelmingly,
adults, it's still, I think, a minority, but probably more than most places don't let adults have smartphones either.
Yeah.
Right. So there's an example of a decision by people that this particular technology is not a good. Now, does that mean that those same people don't, I don't know, go to the doctor or whatever? No, and there's no contradiction there.
Right.
because it's
Yeah.
freedom from seeing technology as just a developing like stream of history that you just have to be a
Right.
part
And
of.
this gets at that accusation that's so often leveled that look at you, you're criticizing the modern system, and then you'll go to the hospital if you get sick, or you're
Right, right.
criticizing the modern system, but then you'll get in an airplane and fly someplace, or
Mhm.
right. And for a lot of people, they're perceiving that as an inconsistency,
Mhm.
but that's because they're understanding this is a sort of all or nothing deal.
Right.
Like we're either desperately pursuing the some sort of divinity, some sort of overcoming our smallness,
Right.
or we get nothing.
Right. Totally.
And it's like, well, that's a false dichotomy. That's a false choice.
And you know what? I think any Christian revolution technology would have to tackle capitalism. What I mean is that you can't have a sort of culturally acceptable pursuit of wealth for its own sake. Now, people will say that that's not what capitalism is. That's fine. So let's just say I'm just talking about
Whatever that is, that's what you're talking
whatever
about.
the pursuit of wealth for whatever the actual culturally accepted pursuit of wealth for its own sake is. That's what I'm talking about. You can't have that and any kind of moderation in technological use or real decision in technological use, because it's once things are by definition not for the sake of the common good but for private gain,
Mm-hmm.
then there are people within a society that will try to, I mean, this is just, again, we're just describing tyranny.
Yeah.
They will produce things and then try to get everyone to use them and push technological development because they gain from it.
Yeah, and what I would say is that this is a tricky situation, and I'll try to explain what I mean, but it's a complicated thing, which is that powerful people, because we've talked about how there's power. One aspect of that power, one essential aspect in a fallen world, even in a fallen world that is, we would say, Christian, and so attempting redemption, moving towards its redemption, moving from imperfect to perfect, attempting to build virtue. The rulers throughout that society do have to use technological forms in order to move sinners or the imperfect, in order to encourage them or to move them, to educate them, to try to move them into their own perfection. This is something that you mentioned, I think, earlier when you were saying that law, for example, can become a technological sort of monolith, or it can be a a necessary remedial action of a ruler, a virtuous ruler, to heal and elevate those who are beneath him. But the reason why I bring that up is that even in a just society, or a more just society, an increasingly just society, the people with power are going to have to use technological forms. If those people in power then are not seeking the common good, but are rather seeking self-interest, they can use those technological forms for their own gain. And it's not necessarily apparent. Like it doesn't matter which one of those it is. To the people who are subject to them, they seem the same.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see what I'm saying? Like it's a very tricky problem, because to the child, who's being disciplined, it's not necessarily clear that whether or not his parent is behaving justly. He just knows he's being disciplined for this thing.
Yeah.
Right. And I think similarly then, this idea that you're saying, that as long as private gain, the pursuit of profit for its own sake, is something that the powerful are allowed to do, as long as that's the case, they'll always be able to get away with exploiting technological means or tyrannical means in general, because part of what it looks like to be just is to also use those means. You see what I'm trying to say? They're not easy to sort.
No, right. And I think and they're hard to sort in a particular moment of discernment, because whether one is using it remedially or tyrannically often is only clear over time.
Right.
And a lot of time, because part of what makes that distinction is whether, once the problem is solved, the technology goes away or
Exactly.
becomes sort of like we talked about with the water wheel.
Right. That's
And
right.
so it's similar with law, right? Because law is a human construction that gets people to operate in a certain way in order to attain that end.
Mm-hmm.
And you might be dealing with the people that really need some harsh law in order to get them to that end that they don't want to pursue, that their will isn't conformed
Right, but
in any
those
way.
people who are being so treated that in that way perceive the person who's treating them that way as a tyrant,
Right.
even if they're not.
And the difference would be that when the people attain what the law intends,
The tyranny fades away.
right, but not for the actual tyrant.
But not for the actual tyrant.
Yeah.
But for the just ruler, that's the way it occurs.
Yeah.
So those forms of technology, governance technology, would behave in the same sort of way that you're talking about, mechanized technology.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
But it does. But there is no solution. I mean, the point is that there is no, and we've said this before, but it's worth bringing up again, that there's no apparatus solution to this problem. Like, the solution has to be that that the pursuit of gain without orientation towards the common good is a socially unacceptable thing.
Right.
Like that has to be enforced at that sort of a level.
Right, which is why it's almost unthinkable apart from conversion.
Yes, exactly right. Yeah.
And I think we've seen this before. I mean, I don't think. Yeah, I mean, people look at the conversion of the Roman Empire, and if there's a technologically advanced sort of group, it's that. Obviously it looks different, but
yeah.
And it didn't change and become the Middle Ages through a system or through, another technology. It changed through conversion.
Right.
And the conversion looks difficult because part of what the conversion means, like you're saying, is taking up, is Christian people, virtuous people, taking up those legal technological forms and using them, and then them fading away.
Right.
But then it's like that's what you would expect to see, but you can't necessarily see it in the moment.
Yeah, that's right.
and even now we look back and we're like, well, the Christians ruined this particular thing.
You can see the errors they made.
Right.
Absolutely.
Whereas another way of looking at it is they used it as long as it was necessary.
Yeah. Yeah. So what's the sort of takeaway here?
Well, it's that at base, tyranny is rooted in fear.
Mm-hmm.
And at base, it has a essential connection to technology because it has to both keep that fear alive and provide an ostensible solution to that fear. And you can see in that sense how the work of the tyrant and then the work of technology as a never-ending project are one and the same.
And a never-ending project that fails.
Right.
Right. Like it never delivers what we're after.
Yeah.
And I think this is such an interesting dynamic that's occurring right now, because of this, like we were talking about earlier, because of this disdain for the digital, with also the being enslaved to it. It's just fascinating, because that wasn't the case in like the 20th century, with the mechanical industrial technology. People liked their cars.
Oh yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, there's a great essay. I forget the title, but it basically tracked car advertisements and how they started, which were like, this car is going to make you go fast and you're going to be free. And then by like 60 years later, it was like, promise this car won't hurt you that much. It's like, I know you hate traffic. They have like pictures of cars that kind of look like you're riding a bike, and I think you're right. I think we're living in a world in which the tyrants have overplayed their hand.
Yep.
And just done something too fast.
Mm-hmm.
Which is namely, we know that theoretically that the creation of a man-made world is the end goal of all idolatry and tyranny. But we wouldn't actually like it unless we were deeply tricked.
Right.
And I think the tyrants had a good chance with, and if they had given another 100 years to develop, but it's just so apparently obvious that the man-made world they're offering is repulsive and it's not even integrated enough to make it like even in an addictive way nice. It's like, no, who would want to spend time like playing with metaverse when there's a real world out there?
I'm totally baffled by it.
or whatever. So it's not like, I think they've overplayed their hand, and you can tell because they look so foolish when like our massively wealthy tech lords sort of propose the future to us. I just don't think anyone...
And everybody's like, no thanks.
Yeah, this sounds like bad.
And it's like, well, you'll like it after we spend $100 billion in marketing.
It's like, yo, you should have told it, but you shouldn't have told us up front. You should have just done the marketing. Yeah, and now it's like it's embarrassing, and I think people are now, instead I mean, what I'm seeing just on the ground here is that instead of like more buying into that, people are just starting to look for places where they can ignore it.
Yeah.
Like both personally in their lives, but then actually moving out of cities and trying to like find just, okay, where can I just not care about that because it's silly? Like I'm seeing a lot of that.
I think so too. Yeah, I see it a lot.
Yeah. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe this is, I mean, look, the tyrants very rarely fall to successful Christian rebellions. That's not like in the sense of like a good war.
Yeah.
That's not usually what happens. Usually they screw themselves up, Yeah. I think typically.
That's right.
So maybe that's what we're living in, is just an age of a tyrannical screw up, and then we get to
pick up the pieces
after whatever disaster they...
All right. I'm up for that.
Okay, good.
All right.
All right, well, thanks for listening, everyone.
That's it.
Smash your phone. Have a good one.